Hey, Charger fans. Welcome back to another injury analysis with me, Jamieson. It's been a little while since I've seen you guys, I think towards the end of last season, but it's nice to be back. We got more content than we can look at, and it's been a little too long. I think it's been a really exciting offseason for the Chargers so far. We're getting closer and closer to training camp and football season in the fall. And so energy is good, especially after that draft. But what I wanted to come and talk to you guys about today is some of the injury history. There's been a lot of turnover on the Chargers over the course of this last season. I think we're going up on maybe close to 30 to 40% of the roster is new. And with that new influx of players that we need to be aware of and talk about something that affects all players coming into the NFL, whether it be from another team or from the draft, and that's the injury history. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to talk about notable free agents and their injury history, as well as some draft injury history with those players that we acquired via that road as well. This will obviously all change. We'll have a final 53 at some point entering the season in a couple of months, and that will some of these players may or may not make it. They probably all will. But I did want to touch on some of the notable injury history because I think it adds a unique perspective for these players and something that we should all be aware of about setting expectations and things as they're entering the season and going on and performing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Before we get into the individual players, these are the draftees and the free agents that I thought had notable injury history and that I wanted to touch on. But the bottom line is everyone in the NFL gets injured. It's not a matter of if, it's unfortunately a matter of when. I think the rate is 98%. So you're going on 100% there. A player will experience / miss at least one game in their career. So it's an expectation. So it's something that I don't think should be looked down upon. Everyone has injuries. They vary in severity, and they're often not always related to individual players. We saw the NFL drop the hip drop tackle and ban it as a means of tackling individuals this season. I think that's a great move for player safety. When you looked at the injury rates following those hip drop tackles, it's somewhere up in the range of 30 or 40%. It's pretty severe. I know it's hard. It makes the defense work even harder and having to manage that, but it is something that for player safety was a great move. We also see that with the kickoff rules. The kickoff was changed. There's been a lot more touchbacks in recent years, and that was because of significant injury risk with players running full steam ahead and making contact. When each player is running 10, 15, 20 miles an hour, you get significant injuries from that. So the new kickoff rules are designed to, again, reintroduce returns, encourage returns, but reduce the high impact play. And those players are actually, I believe, only starting about 5 or 10 yards apart off the kickoff. So and they will not be getting running starts in the same way they used to. So again, all in the conscious of the NFL trying to be a little bit more cognizant of injuries to prevent them. So everyone gets injured. And the important distinction when we talk about injury is what is related, what is injury history, what is someone who's tend to be injury prone, in quotes, versus someone who just has bad injury luck. And I'll talk about how we look at that and how we evaluate that, and something that you can all take away and look at future players when you're kind of making this distinction. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with the draftees. So Ladd McConkey, second round pick, wide receiver, fairly minor injury history in college, nothing too significant. He had some turf toe and knee tendonitis, separate injuries. And then he had a lumbar strain last season and a right low ankle sprain that caused him to miss a series of games at the beginning of the year. He did finish out the season and played well, and then we didn't have a recurrence of these. And so using him as an example, he's a player who had a series of injuries. They're all sort of unrelated body parts, and they tend to be different types of injuries. So when we're looking at soft tissue versus hard or bony injuries, his tend to be all soft tissue, but it's different soft tissue. So we're not seeing hamstring repeatedly. We're not seeing repeated high ankle sprains or repeated low ankle sprains. These all generally separate issues. So when we're looking at him, something that he's been knocked on for the course of the season is his weight. He's a little bit smaller than the average wide receiver. I believe he's clocked at maybe 6 foot, about 185, 190. People are saying he's going to be slot only. He played a lot of outside at Georgia. He's a little bit smaller for the typical outside role, but he has played a significant amount of snaps on the outside and was fairly injury resilient in college. So it'll be something to keep an eye on as he goes on and through the season. And again, these players are young, specifically for the draftees. They're in their early 20s. Most of them, people like Joel, 21 years old. these guys are still developing, believe it or not. They will continue to grow and get bigger until they're 24, 25, 26 years old. And they'll be continuing to be able to develop. And the Chargers strength and conditioning staff led by Ben Herbert will help them prevent these injuries. Again, he gave an excellent press conference. I'd recommend everyone take a look at it. But he views his job as, how do I make my players more resilient? Injuries happen, they're going to happen, but how do I strengthen specific muscles, specific muscle groups, specific joints to give these players the best possible chance of making it through a full NFL season? So Ladd McConkey, overall, not too worried about him over the course of the year. Junior Colson. I put him on here again, not a significant medical history here. He had a foot injury in 2022, did not miss any games. He actually broke both of his hands, or he broke his left hand, which you can see here in a club, and then he broke a couple of fingers on his right. So he's actually playing in a splint here. And he played basically the rest of the season. There's remind you, the national championship season with basically 2 clubs on his hand. You can do that as a linebacker. Obviously, you don't need your fingers, ideally, when you're making the most of your plays. But he's a very tough player. Throughout all these injuries, he didn't miss a single game. He was actually voted Michigan's toughest player by his peers, his teammates. So that, I think, that is something to speak of. He's someone who has faced injuries, but if he's able to, he's going to be on that field, which I think is, again, as Harbaugh is trying to reset this culture, people have made a lot of emphasis on, Junior Colson is a Harbaugh player, someone who works hard, someone who wants to play, and someone who's not afraid to get dirty. And if that comes with an injury, he's willing to kind of work his way through that and play through that, and again, produce at really high numbers. So not significant injury history. Again, these are freak injuries, bony injuries that just kind of happen when you play linebacker, but not like a repeated soft tissue injury like a hamstring. All right, this one, there's a lot more to talk about. Justin Eboigbe. I apologize if I mispronounced that. So he had what was thought by many to be a career-ending injury. He suffered what's called a herniated cervical disc. So in between your vertebra, which are the bony parts of your spine, you have little pockets of essentially very thin, you can think of it like Tempur-Pedic foam or jelly. And that jelly can sometimes, when the outside of the disc ruptures, you can have that jelly kind of ooze out, and that's called a herniated disc. The disc kind of slips out of position between the vertebra, and this one was actually severe enough that it was touching his spine. And this happened in practice. He continued to practice, had an MRI, went with the neck pain. They realized that this injury was quite severe, and he had to have surgery. So they had what's called a fusion. So they, again, a pretty serious cervical surgery. They go in between the 2 bones, the 2 vertebra. They make sure to take out the part of the disc that's impinging on the nerve. So make sure the spinal cord has room to breathe. And they actually fuse those 2 bones. There's a number of different techniques to do that. That's a little bit in the weeds, but essentially those 2 vertebrae are now connected. So I don't know exactly what level that occurs at. For those that are interested, there's 7 cervical vertebrae, or 8, excuse me. It's those 2 vertebrae are now fused. Now, that was 2022. That was actually almost 2 years ago. He played all of 2023 without incident. And so it's something to be aware of. This is something that Leighton Vander Esch, there's a couple other NFL players that have had this, that may have had to retire early because of risk from this. But notably in his press conference, he noted that he has 0 limitations, that he's playing through this, and that this is something that he doesn't even worry about. He doesn't really rehab anymore. It's probably something the Chargers are certainly aware about, and they're obviously not too worried about this injury going forward. Something he'll continue to get strength and conditioning along with his neck muscles. I think that was honestly some of the first work that the whole team was doing, neck workouts, making sure that all those neck muscles are nice and strong. For 2 reasons, really: to prevent concussions is the main one, because that head flopping here to the ground is a huge risk of concussions. If you have good neck muscles, you can kind of help prevent that. And 2, for him specifically, make sure that cervical spine is nice and stable. So something that to be aware of. We'll see how much playing time he gets during the course of the season. There's not a ton of defensive line depth that the Chargers have right now, so I assume he'll get some amount of play. It's something for us to be aware of as that goes through. Cam Hart. This is probably one of my favorite draft prospects. I think he's got a lot of potential, untapped potential. But he did have a series of shoulder injuries, and that's kind of one of the big 3 things that we look at as something that tends to be a little bit more recurrent when it comes to injury history. The shoulder has a lot of different muscles. It's a very unique joint where it has to have a lot of degrees of mobility. Your shoulder, again, you have to be able to move it up, down, sideways at an angle. So because of that, you have a lot of soft tissue and muscles in there that help control that shoulder. And if one of those fails or one of them has an injury, this is something that Justin Herbert dealt with in his non-throwing, his left shoulder. He had a labral tear. I think Cam Hart's had now 3 surgeries. It's either 2 on the right and 1 on the left, or vice versa, to kind of, again, all to repair that shoulder and give back that added stability. That was 2 years ago. This 2023 season, he played without incident, which is promising that he'll be able to have an NFL career and not have a recurrence. But this is something that we should keep an eye on. He's got a ton of potential. He's a big guy. He's a fast guy. So if that traits can jump off and onto the field and translate well, he could be an exciting young player. But again, shoulder injuries, along with hamstring injuries and high ankle injuries, are things that we tend to think about as more of an injury-prone player. Those are joints that, once injured, have some stability issues long-term. So hopefully he has a whole season under his belt that this will not be an issue, but only time will tell. And we'll have to see how he plays out throughout training camp and into that first few NFL seasons. All right, let's get over to the Chargers free agents. So this is probably the one that most people would associate with injury history when we're talking about free agent acquisitions for the Chargers. JK Dobbins, very, very talented runner, incredibly talented, has had a very unfortunate amount of injury history. And he's an example of a player that I think the Chargers are going to get pretty incredible value. And again, only time will tell. We'll have to see how his Achilles repair is going and whether he can participate in training camp in early season. But he's a player I want to highlight as an example of, these are freak injuries. So soft tissue injuries in general. So he had, again, a pretty severe knee injury. So most people know he tore his ACL, but he had what was called a grade 3 ACL tear. So that's a significant, the ACL tear is completely ruptured, but he also damaged his knee cartilage. And I believe he damaged some of his bone as well. So that's a really serious, and I think the MCL or LCL, I can't quite remember, but again, we have a bunch of ligaments around the knee. He damaged multiple. It wasn't just the ACL that went. And that was a very serious knee injury. It required pretty extensive repair. He came back the following season, played a few games, didn't feel quite right. After further evaluation, they decided to go back in there and clean up scar tissue. So he didn't re-injure his knee. I think that's something that a lot of people get wrong. I think he tore his ACL twice. He did not. The ACL was intact. But sometimes when you have these extensive injuries, you get scar tissue all around the joint, around the knee, and players feel that, and they can kind of sense they're not able to maybe bend all the way or push off all the way. He just didn't feel quite right. So to his credit, he worked with the Baltimore staff. They discussed it, and he went back and had what's called a clean out surgery. So again, arthroscopic, small holes. They go in there, they assess the knee overall, they take out some of that scar tissue. He came back that same season. He actually finished out that season quite well, had a couple of really good games and felt much better. So that knee history is kind of behind him. Unfortunately, during week 1, 2023, he tore his Achilles, and that was last year, and then missed the entirety of the season. Again, these are separate injuries. It's not a soft tissue injury where it's like a hamstring, it's a muscle, or that's repeatedly getting injured or sensitive. These are tendons. Again, these are where the muscle is attached to bone. Freak injuries. But the things that are going in his favor is that they're separate. He didn't do the same knee twice. You are at a higher risk when you do tear an ACL. It's not that much higher than a non-player, but it is higher. But these are different, separate injuries. And he's also a very young player. So in contrast to Aaron Rodgers, who's going on 40, the younger people just tend to heal better. I believe he's 26, 27 years old. He's been rehabbing this with the Chargers team. He's been running. He's about 9 months out, I think, right about now. So we'll see. I think he's looking good to at least participate in training camp. I think the Chargers they have the luxury of having a few other running backs on their roster. They can kind of spread out a workload early on in the year. But he's a player I think the Chargers got at an incredible value. And I think when healthy, he could be one of the top running backs in the league. So my expectation is by week 4, week 5, week 6, he will have gotten back into football shape. He'll have seen some contact. Hopefully they on-ramp him up and just get him back and get everything kind of nice and warm. But I think week 6 onwards, we could be seeing a JK Dobbins show. And what this looks like as a Gus Edwards beginning starts to see a lot more of him mixing in there with Kamani Vidal and Isaiah Spiller and whoever else is still in that running back room when the time comes. So again, a player who on paper has a really scary injury history, but is young. And my number one reason. Number two, has different. These are two different injuries. They were two freak injuries, unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily have or put a tag on a player as an injury history and an injury prone player. So we'll see how JK Dobbins does this year with the ramping up of his ability. But I have a sneaky suspicion that he's going to be just fine, and that he, if so, has the potential to be one of the most underrated free agent signings of the summer. All right, Kristian Fulton, a cornerback. He is a player who also has some history with what's tends to be a little bit more scarier injury, which is a hamstring injury. Last season, he actually ended the season on IR with a hamstring strain. Doesn't on the surface look like that significant of an injury, but we've talked a lot about hamstring injuries. They're a terrible problem in the NFL. They're very common. And players who injure it in the same season have about a 30 to 40% recurrence rate if they come back to playing. And even season to season, we see that at a similar rate. So a player who has had a history of hamstring issues will tend to have between a 30 and 40% risk of suffering another hamstring injury in the future. So the Chargers are a little bit thin on corner. Some of the knocks on the current class is that they don't really have a true number one, someone to match up against the Devontae Adams, etc., and those types of receivers. And Kristian Fulton, again, has potential. This was sort of just a one-off hamstring strain that was placed on IR for the last year, but it's something that will need to be worried, something to keep an eye on certainly as well. I'm sure the Chargers are doing what they can to prevent these types of injuries, but hamstring injuries are just really, really hard. The whole NFL suffers from it. So when we're thinking about the Chargers' safety depth, if Kristian Fulton is considered to be one of our outside starters, Mustibo Asante slides it on their side, and the nickel cornerback, there could be room for more cornerback action, including players like Cam Hart or younger players to get in here, especially if we expect someone like Kristian Fulton that might have to deal with this. If a 30% chance is not small, unfortunately, so it's something they can try to prevent, but it just happens at the speed and play of football. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one in particular. All right, I think this is my last one here. Hayden Hurst. He has some previous injury history. It's all pretty unrelated. Soft tissue injuries, including his hamstring. He had a groin injury very similar to Joey Bosa, called a sports hernia injury that he had surgery for a couple seasons ago. He's a little bit to be honest, he's a little bit younger than I thought he was. I thought he'd been around a while. I think he's like 28, 29 years old. The most significant injury history in recent memory is he had a really severe concussion last season that he was actually placed on an IR for and eventually missed, I believe, the last 4 or 5 games of the NFL season for the Panthers. He said he probably could have come back if the Panthers were in contention, but we obviously know that's how the Bears got their number 1 pick. So he didn't really feel like, and the front office of the Panthers, to their credit, didn't feel like they should put him at additional risk. That concussion that he suffered was pretty severe, and he actually was suffered what's called post-traumatic amnesia, where he actually had loss of memory, not only around that specific incident, but in the days and kind of the weeks after that incident as well. So it's a little bit scary. He was seen by an independent neurologist. He was cleared. It's not something that concussions in general are kind of hard to predict. Obviously, some players tend to get repeated ones, and after a couple, the risk for long-term damage in CTE is quite high. I don't want to get into the CTE kind of issue now, but if people are interested, it's something we can talk about in the future. But in his specific instance, this was the first one he's had, given even though it was a pretty severe one. So something that we'll keep an eye on. The Chargers tight end room obviously is pretty deep at the moment. I believe they have anywhere, if you classify Ben Mason as a tight end as well. Some people say he's a fullback, one or the other. Anyway, there's a lot of players in that room, so they have some depth. But he is going to be the primary receiving tight end option, or is going to think to be the primary tight end receiving option for Justin Herbert this season. So something to keep an eye on and be aware of. And that's all I got. So that was a deep dive into a lot of the draftees and a lot of the free agent additions who have an injury history. So hopefully you learned a little bit about which players we should keep a little bit closer of an eye on this season. And hopefully you also learned a little bit about evaluating other players when you were thinking of this injury-prone designation. Everyone in the NFL gets injured. It happens. It's a rough sport. But when we're thinking of evaluating Chargers, or when you put yourself in the shoes of a Chargers medical staff and the Chargers general manager and those kind of player facilitators, when they're looking at players and making these decisions, those are the types of injuries like hamstring strains, injuries like shoulder instability, injuries like high ankle sprains and repeated high ankle sprains. Those are the ones that they're more worried about because those tend to be more recurrent versus more freak, although unfortunate injuries like an Achilles tear or a ACL tear, which in the past, even 10, 15 years ago, would be career-ending injuries. But thanks to modern medicine and modern surgery, those players are coming back and often having pretty successful careers following those injuries. So those ones can be rehabbed and those players can be successful. Again, more freak injuries versus what's actually problematic over time. So that's all I got for you today. If you have any questions, please put it in the comments. I'm happy to try to provide more information as it comes out, and hopefully we'll have more to talk about in the coming months as we're going towards free agency. So I appreciate you guys all for taking the time and tuning in. Until next time, guys, Bolts up.